My fiancé forgot to end the call, and I overheard his conversation with his parents that changed everything. 3 years ago, my life was the definition of simplicity. I worked at a cozy local bakery, greeted familiar faces every morning, and lived in a modest apartment a few blocks from my childhood home. Then, Ethan walked into my world, changing everything. He was charming in the way that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. Our connection was instant, almost too good to be true. Within months, we were inseparable. Ethan introduced me to his affluent world, weekend getaways, exclusive dinners, and the kind of lifestyle I'd only seen in movies. But beyond the glitz, he had a certain vulnerability, a side he rarely showed anyone else. It made me believe we had something real. A year into our relationship, I discovered I was pregnant. The news didn't come as a joyful surprise for Ethan. He'd always been upfront about his fears of becoming a father, his worries about responsibility, the loss of freedom. But I couldn't bring myself to consider any option other than keeping the baby. I thought my love for him, for us, would be enough to convince him that we could face anything together. The pregnancy was a roller coaster. Ethan's initial resistance made me question everything, but as my belly grew, so did his involvement. By the time our twin boys, Noah and Lucas, were born, he seemed to have fully embraced fatherhood. He proposed to me a week later, holding a ring I'd later learn his mother had insisted he use, an heirloom from her side of the family. I said yes, overwhelmed by the moment and the hope that we were finally aligned. Ethan's parents had always been a looming presence in our relationship. His mother, elegant and calculating, rarely hid her disapproval of me. His father, a stoic businessman, was polite but distant. They weren't cruel, but their expectations were clear. Ethan's future was meant to be extraordinary, unmarred by what they likely saw as my ordinary influence. The twins softened them slightly. Their grandsons were a bridge I hadn't anticipated. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of last-minute details and overwhelming emotions. My parents were ecstatic, buzzing with excitement. They'd always been my rock, their love unwavering no matter what. But I couldn't shake the subtle tension between Ethan and me. He'd been distant lately, claiming work stress and wedding planning were taking a toll. The night before the wedding, Ethan decided to stay at his parents' house. It wasn't entirely unexpected, a family tradition, he'd said. I tried not to read too much into it, convincing myself it was just pre-wedding jitters. As I tucked the boys into bed, I thought about how far we'd come. Tomorrow, I'd walk down the aisle and officially start our lives as a family. Later that evening, my phone buzzed. It was Ethan. He sounded tired, his voice softer than usual as he asked how the boys were doing. We talked briefly about the wedding plans, and he promised he'd call again in the morning. But as I ended the call, I noticed something strange. He hadn't hung up. My name was still on the screen, and faint voices trickled through the receiver. I hesitated, unsure if I should hang up or listen. Curiosity won. What I heard froze me in place. Ethan's voice was there, unmistakable, but the words he spoke weren't meant for me. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and the man I thought I knew had slipped away, revealing something far more troubling. What I heard next sent a chill down my spine. My heart raced, a mixture of dread and disbelief as I strained to make sense of his words. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, leaving me gasping for air. This wasn't just pre-wedding nerves. This was something deeper, something that would change everything. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, unable to move, the weight of his betrayal crushing down on me. Tomorrow was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, I was left with a question that demanded an answer. Who was the man I was about to marry, and how much of him had been a lie? I sat there, frozen, clutching the phone as Ethan's words sank into my mind like shards of glass. His tone was low but sharp, the kind of voice he used when he was truly upset. The faint hum of his parents' voices chimed in, but it was his words that stole my breath. He started by saying how much he loved his sons, a confession that might have warmed my heart if not for the venom that followed. He admitted he felt trapped, that this wasn't the life he had envisioned. I strained to hear every word, my stomach twisting as he described me, not with love or respect, but as a burden. His mother's voice cut through, calm and calculating, urging him to stay the course. She reminded him of their family's expectations, the importance of preserving their image. Her words were laced with manipulation, veiled threats about his future, their legacy, and the will. The truth hit me like a tidal wave. Ethan was being coerced. But it wasn't just his parents pulling the strings. He played his part willingly, feeding their narrative while painting me as the antagonist. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone against the wall, but I couldn't. My twins were asleep in the next room, their soft breathing the only sound grounding me in that moment. Instead, I sat still, letting the weight of their conversation crush me. Ethan's father's voice came next, cold and commanding. He emphasized the importance of sacrifice, of doing what was necessary for the family. There was no mention of love, no acknowledgement of the life we had built together. To them, I was just a roadblock, a misstep Ethan had made that needed correcting. Ethan's response was what shattered me completely. He didn't argue. He didn't defend me, didn't push back against their toxic rhetoric. Instead, he agreed. He spoke about how much he resented the situation, how he felt like he had no choice but to marry me. His words were calculated, a blend of bitterness and compliance that left no room for doubt. The man I thought loved me was a stranger. The call ended, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I stayed there for what felt like hours, the phone still clutched in my hand, replaying every word in my mind. Doubts that had lingered in the back of my mind came rushing forward, too loud to ignore. The way he'd been distant, his reluctance to talk about the future, even his proposal, was it all a lie? I felt a hollow ache in my chest, but I couldn't afford to break down. My sons needed me, and I couldn't let them see me like this. I moved mechanically, packing a bag with essentials for the boys and myself. My mind raced with possibilities, but one thing was clear. I couldn't stay here. The drive to the hotel was a blur. I checked in under a pseudonym, using cash to avoid leaving a trail. It felt dramatic, like something out of a movie, but I couldn't shake the paranoia that someone might try to stop me. Once inside the room, I locked the door and collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion finally catching up with me. The twins slept soundly in the small crib provided by the hotel, their innocence a stark contrast to the turmoil in my heart. I stared at the ceiling, replaying Ethan's words, trying to reconcile the man I loved with the man I had overheard. My heart ached, not just for myself, but for the life I had envisioned for my boys. They deserved better, and so did I. Doubts swirled in my mind. Had Ethan ever truly loved me, or had I been a convenient choice, a box to tick off on his parents' checklist? The thought made me nauseous. Every moment we'd shared felt tainted, every promise hollow. I couldn't decide if I was more angry or heartbroken. Both emotions fought for dominance, leaving me paralyzed. The unanswered questions loomed large. What was I supposed to do now? Could I confront Ethan, demand the truth, and force him to face the consequences of his actions? Or was it better to walk away, to protect my children from the toxicity that had seeped into our lives? Sleep didn't come easily that night. When it finally did, it was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of Ethan's betrayal and my boys' uncertain future. I woke up with a newfound resolve, though. Whatever came next, it had to be for their sake. They deserved a mother who was strong enough to make the tough decisions. But as I sat there, watching the sun rise through the hotel window, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Ethan's betrayal was only the beginning. The next steps would test me in ways I couldn't yet imagine. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to face them. I returned to the house the next morning, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. The drive felt endless, every turn on the familiar roads pulling me closer to the confrontation I'd been dreading. I knew Ethan would be there. I could sense it, and I couldn't avoid what needed to be done. The twins were safe with my parents, giving me the space to face this alone. The house was eerily quiet when I arrived. As I stepped inside, my eyes scanned the living room, once a place of comfort, but now tainted with the echoes of betrayal. Ethan's car was in the driveway, and sure enough, he appeared moments later, his face pale and drawn. The weight of last night's conversation must have been bearing down on him too. He looked at me with a mix of relief and confusion, clearly unsettled by my sudden disappearance. His first words were hesitant as he asked where I'd been and where the boys were. I told him they were safe with my parents, keeping my tone calm and measured. Then, without giving him a chance to deflect, I asked the question that had been haunting me. Did he truly love me, and did he really want to marry me? He paused, visibly taken aback, before answering. His response was filled with declarations of love and assurances that he wanted the wedding to happen. Yet, as he spoke, there was a hesitation in his voice that made me question the sincerity behind his words. His words didn't match the actions I'd witnessed, and they certainly didn't erase the hurt. I waited for him to finish, letting the silence hang heavy between us. Then, I told him about the phone call, every word I'd overheard, every painful truth he'd revealed. His face fell, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and shame. For the first time, Ethan was speechless. He'd been caught, his carefully constructed narrative unraveling before him. The confrontation was raw, stripped of the pretense that had defined so much of our relationship. I didn't shout or cry. I simply laid out the facts, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. I told him I deserved better, that our sons deserved better. I told him I wouldn't marry a man who saw me as a burden, who let his parents dictate his every move. Ethan tried to respond, but his words lacked conviction. He spoke of change, of wanting to make things right, but it was clear he didn't know how. His dependence on his parents' approval was too deeply ingrained, his identity too tied to their expectations. As much as he might have wanted to break free, he didn't have the strength to do it. And I wasn't willing to wait around for him to figure it out. Leaving him standing in that room was one of the hardest things I've ever done. There was a part of me that wanted to stay, to believe in the possibility of redemption. But the larger part of me knew better. I'd spent too long compromising, too long hoping for a version of Ethan that didn't exist. It was time to put myself and my children first. The next step was informing our families. My parents were heartbroken but supportive, their disappointment in Ethan mirroring my own. They promised to stand by me, to help in any way they could. Telling Ethan's parents was a different story. His mother's response was cold and dismissive, as though I'd confirmed her worst fears about me. His father's silence was deafening, a clear indication of where his loyalties lay. Despite their reactions, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in months. The weight of pretending, of trying to fit into a mold I'd never wanted, was finally lifted. I began making arrangements to move out, focusing on creating a stable environment for the twins. The wedding was canceled, the venue informed, and the invitations discarded. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, a reminder that I was capable of standing on my own. Ethan's reaction in the days that followed was a mix of desperation and resignation. He called me repeatedly, his messages swinging between apologies and pleas for another chance. But his words, like his earlier promises, rang hollow. I'd given him my trust, my love, and he'd shown me where his priorities lay. There was no going back. As I packed the last of my belongings, I found myself reflecting on the person I'd been when I met Ethan. I'd been young and hopeful, willing to overlook red flags in the name of love. But now, with my sons as my guiding light, I saw things differently. Love wasn't enough. Respect, trust, and partnership, those were the foundations of a real relationship. And I deserved nothing less. Ethan's parting words lingered in my mind as I left the house for the last time. He'd admitted he didn't know who he was without his parents' influence, that he felt lost without their approval. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, but it wasn't enough to change my decision. I hoped he'd find his way, but I couldn't be the one to guide him. As I drove away, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to navigate. For the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them, for myself and for my sons. The day after I left the house for good, I found myself sitting in a lawyer's office, a place I never imagined I'd need to be. The walls were lined with books, and the air carried a sterile seriousness that matched the weight of my decision. I needed to protect my boys. Ethan's parents' influence was too powerful to ignore, and I couldn't risk them manipulating their way into controlling my sons' lives. The lawyer, a composed woman in her 40s, listened intently as I laid out my concerns. I explained Ethan's dependence on his parents and their ability to twist any situation to suit their narrative. She assured me that as the boy's primary caregiver, I had a strong case for full custody. Still, the thought of going up against Ethan's family with their resources and connections made my stomach churn. In the days that followed, I began gathering everything I needed: documentation of the time I spent with the boys, financial records, and any communication that could support my case. It was exhausting, emotionally and physically, but every step felt like a shield I was building to protect my family. Ethan's reaction to my legal preparations was as volatile as I feared. At first, he seemed confused, caught off guard by the seriousness of my actions. He asked why I was involving lawyers and insisted we could resolve things privately. But when I stood firm, his confusion turned to frustration. His parents' influence was unmistakable. I could hear their words in his arguments, the veiled threats and attempts to guilt me into compliance. One evening, Ethan showed up at my parents' house unannounced. He was disheveled, his usual composure replaced by a frantic energy. He demanded to see the boys, his voice loud enough to draw my father to the door. The scene that unfolded was painful to witness. Ethan's desperation was palpable, but it was clear he wasn't acting out of love for the boys. He was a man cornered, grappling with the loss of control and the weight of his parents' expectations. The confrontation escalated when Ethan's parents got involved. They arranged a public meeting at a neutral location, framing it as a chance to mediate. I agreed, hoping to avoid a drawn-out legal battle, but the meeting was anything but productive. Ethan's mother dominated the conversation, her words calculated and condescending. She spoke about the importance of family unity, about the boys needing their father, but her true motive was clear: control. Ethan sat there, silent for most of the meeting, his head bowed, as if he were a child being scolded. When he did speak, it was to echo his mother's sentiments, his voice lacking conviction. It was a painful reminder of the man I'd overheard on the phone, the man who couldn't stand up for himself, let alone for us. By the end of the meeting, any lingering doubts I had were gone. Ethan's parents didn't see me as an individual or a mother. They saw me as an obstacle. And Ethan, despite his occasional attempts to reconcile, was too entrenched in their world to break free. It wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about ensuring that my boys would grow up in an environment where they were loved unconditionally, without strings attached or ulterior motives. The emotional toll of those weeks was immense. I found myself questioning every decision, wondering if I was doing the right thing. But every time I looked at Noah and Lucas, their innocent faces reminded me of my purpose. They deserved a life free from the toxicity that had defined my relationship with Ethan and his family. As the custody proceedings moved forward, I found strength in unexpected places. My parents were unwavering in their support, stepping in to help with the boys, and reminding me of my own resilience. Friends reached out, offering words of encouragement and sharing their own stories of overcoming hardship. Each gesture, no matter how small, reinforced my resolve. Ethan's behavior became increasingly erratic as the reality of the situation set in. His calls and messages swung wildly between apologetic and accusatory, a reflection of his inner turmoil. His desperation was evident, but it only confirmed what I'd already known. He wasn't fighting for the boys because he loved them. He was fighting because he couldn't bear to lose, because his parents wouldn't allow it. The final confrontation came during a court-ordered mediation session. Ethan's parents were there, their presence looming over the proceedings like a dark cloud. The mediator tried to steer the conversation toward compromise, but it was clear from the start that there would be no middle ground. Ethan's mother dominated the discussion once again, her words laced with thinly veiled threats about how far they were willing to go. But this time, I didn't falter. I spoke clearly and firmly, outlining my concerns and my reasons for seeking full custody. I described the emotional manipulation, the lack of stability, and the toxic dynamics that had defined my relationship with Ethan and his family. The mediator listened, taking notes, and for the first time, I felt truly heard. When the session ended, Ethan looked at me with a mixture of anger and sadness. His parents left without a word, their expressions cold and calculating. I knew the battle wasn't over, but I also knew I'd taken a crucial step toward securing a better future for my boys. The stakes were high, but so was my determination. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The day I received the notice was one I'll never forget. After weeks of legal back and forth, endless mediation sessions, and emotional turmoil, Ethan finally signed the documents relinquishing his parental rights. The decision, though heartbreaking in its own way, felt like the end of a long, bitter chapter. It was a break from the toxic cycle that had consumed both of our lives, driven largely by his parents' overbearing influence. There were no dramatic confrontations or teary goodbyes. The paperwork arrived quietly, a simple envelope that signaled the end of Ethan's legal ties to our sons. I held it in my hands for a moment, letting the reality sink in. It was a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that Noah and Lucas would no longer be subjected to the manipulations of Ethan's family, and sadness for the man Ethan could have been if he'd chosen a different path. With the custody battle behind me, I focused on rebuilding our lives. I found a small but cozy apartment a few blocks from my parents' home. The space was modest, a far cry from the house Ethan and I had shared, but it was ours. It felt like a fresh start, unburdened by the memories of what had been. My parents were a constant presence, helping me settle in and adjust to this new phase of life. Balancing work and motherhood was a challenge, but it was one I faced head-on. My parents' support and the help of a kind-hearted nanny made all the difference. The nanny, a woman named Claire, quickly became an integral part of our lives. Her warmth and patience were a blessing, and she treated Noah and Lucas as if they were her own. With her help, I was able to return to work, regaining a sense of independence and stability. Life took on a new rhythm. The mornings were filled with the chaos of getting the twins ready for daycare, followed by the steady hum of work, and evenings spent in the warm company of my family. It wasn't easy, but it was fulfilling in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Each day felt like a step forward, a small victory in the journey to rebuild. Ethan reached out one last time, an unexpected encounter that left me both shaken and resolute. He asked to meet, and though I was hesitant, I agreed, curious to see what he had to say. The meeting was brief, held in a neutral setting where neither of us could feel too vulnerable. He looked different, tired, older, as though the weight of his decisions had finally caught up with him. His words were a mix of apologies and explanations, an attempt to justify his actions while seeking some form of redemption. He spoke about his parents' control, his regrets, and his hope to provide financial support for the boys, even if he couldn't be in their lives. But as he spoke, I realized that his gestures, though well-meaning, came too late. The damage was done, and I had no intention of tethering myself to him through financial dependency. I declined his offer, choosing dignity over material support. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the right one. I'd fought too hard for my independence to compromise it now. Ethan's expression was one of resignation, a silent acknowledgement that there was no going back. As I walked away, I felt a sense of closure, a finality that allowed me to truly move on. The weeks that followed were transformative. I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here, the highs and lows, the heartbreak and resilience. It hadn't been an easy road, but it had shaped me into the person I was becoming. I learned to value my own strength, to trust my instincts, and to prioritize the well-being of my children above all else. Noah and Lucas became my anchor, their laughter and curiosity a constant reminder of what truly mattered. They thrived in our new environment, their innocence untainted by the struggles I'd faced. Watching them grow filled me with a sense of purpose, a determination to build a future that was stable, loving, and full of possibility. My family's unwavering support was a beacon of hope through it all. My parents, who had stood by me in my darkest moments, became my partners in raising the twins. Their love and guidance were a testament to the strength of our bond, a reminder that I was never truly alone. As I looked to the future, I felt a renewed sense of hope. The scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined me. They were a part of my story, a reminder of what I'd overcome. And as I stood at the threshold of this new chapter, I was ready to embrace it with open arms. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. Free from the shadows of a toxic relationship, free to chart my own path, and free to create a life filled with love, laughter, and resilience. The road ahead was mine to navigate, and I was ready to face whatever came next, not just for myself, but for Noah and Lucas. Together, we were unstoppable.